The Crimson Dirks, Book 1. Tira Bloodfire didn't want just any crew. Bandits never built great houses. They had no structure, organization, nor legacy. They had few tactics in the field and little design for the future. Worst of all, they had no loyalty beyond filling their own pockets. A bandit clan was a pack of stray dogs fighting for scraps, willing to bite the hand if it dared to feed them. Growing up in Balmora, Tira knew that the great houses of Morrowind were built on blood. Yet, as an orphan child and a Nord amongst elves, her concept of family was one forged from experience. It wasn't the bandits and cutthroats, but the loners and outcasts she identified with most. So when she picked out the crew that would become the Crimson Dirks, she sought out the qualities that best defined herself. What she wanted were survivors. To find them, she would first need connections. For this, she sought the help of a dark elf named Reaver. The Dunmer had no real name to speak of. Some speculated he was once a noble, having abandoned his titles and claims for a new one. Others believed he was with the Morag Tong, assassins having little use for their birth name. Tira, meanwhile, had first met the brigand as a child begging in the streets. The dark elf had fixed his blood-red eyes upon this orphan girl, ashen and starved, and deigned to fill her alms bowl. When she looked down, she found neither food nor gold, but a knife. "This isn't a gift, little Netch," the Dunmer cautioned, throat scarred with ash. "Your first score belongs to me." That night, young Tira would make good on that promise, delivering a single ruby into the Ashlander's palm. It glowed crimson like fire and blood, and from that day she was known as Tira Bloodfire, earning her name just as Reaver did from his deeds. As the years passed, the Dunmer kept a close eye on the Nord, tracking her growth from a cutpurse to a bandit. And while she considered her debt to Reaver paid, whenever their paths crossed, he would continue to demand a cut. 8 years later, and the two had gone their separate ways, not just in distance, but in spirit and mind. Tira had matured into a tenacious warrior, her physique chiseled and rough, a body forged in crucible of blood and ash. Reaver, on the other hand, had grown fat and lazy, content to skim off the labor of his subordinates while he spent his days in quiet repose. As Tira stood before him, he played with a ruby in his palm, occasionally using his forearm to wipe the saliva from his greasy lips. While Tira recognized the gem almost immediately, the dark elf bared little resemblance to the vicious killer she once knew. Perhaps it was Cyrodiil that changed him. He had traded his Netch leather for fine silks, his dagger for a silver spoon, and his ashland cave for a high-born residence in the heart of Skingrad. His scowl was not one of rage, but irritation, chiefly at his guest for tracking mud on his freshly waxed floors. Only the eyes, scarlet and piercing, betrayed his former identity. "I'm new to Cyrodiil," she said, placing a bag of gold on the table as tithe. "And I need a crew." The Dunmer beckoned a servant to hand him the gold, as he could no longer be bothered to reach for it. He examined the bag briefly to judge its weight, before shooing the servant and the gold aside. Tira wondered if she had been better served filling the bag with cakes. "I will help you find these men," the Dunmer croaked, finger rapping on the table. "But remember, little Netch, your first score belongs to me." Of men who fit her requirements, there were 3. Azrael, the high elf hunter, had grown up in an orphanage. Palladius was a former guardsman dismissed for beating a pickpocket to death. Antonius was a hedge mage who spent more time at the tavern than the guild. There were still others she wanted before the crew could be whole. She wanted a blacksmith to forge arms and muscle to wield it. She wanted a thief who could stalk their prey in the shadows and assassins to slit their throats. She wanted scouts to glean information and sharper minds to decipher their code. And she was willing to travel the breadth of Tamriel to find them. But for this first job, 3 was more than enough. 1 was all she needed. After all, she had already cased the building, having been invited as a guest. She had seen the servant girl deposit the gold in the next room, and the piles of riches scattered throughout the house. And she had watched as their plump horker of an owner lost his edge and taste for the work. For it was the river and all his riches that they could come for first. A week later, the 3 sealed their pact in blood. Azrael and Palladius, being trained warriors, made quick work of the guards. Antonius bespelled the servants with his magic, and together the crew filled the wagons with their spoils. But before all that was done, Tira first found the once fearsome Reaver in his bedchambers, helpless to stop what his greed had ordained. In the shadow of a lantern's light, the Nord approached him with arms extended. In one hand was the bag of gold she had given him the week prior. In the other was the knife he had placed in her alms bowl so many years ago. "I want you to have this," Reaver said, placing the ruby on the nightstand beside him. Tira, for her part, never said a word. "I wasn't always a Reaver," the dark elf continued. "I used to have a proper name. Cassival, they called me. Funny story, there's a Dunmer boy peddling for alms outside the 2 Sisters' Lodge with the same name." Upon hearing his words, Tira's eyes met Reaver's for the last time, standing over him as he once did her. Perhaps in that moment another deal was made, understood, but left unspoken. Seconds later, she plunged the knife into his heart. When it was done, Tira wiped the blood-stained dirk on the bedsheet and picked up the ruby from the nightstand. In the hours that passed, the crew sacked the place clean, all save the bag of gold, which she left next to her former employer's corpse. The first score, after all, belonged to him. The rest she took for herself. Book 2. In the year following its inception, the Crimson Dirks had more than tripled in size and had now numbered 15. Tira Bloodfire had found her blacksmith in the Imperial City, an orc named Yaktu. She had recruited cunning battle mages in the Breton twins, Irvin and Edward. In Elsewhere, she met Mesara, a street thief who had grown into a capable blade. There were the wood elf archers, Fathrus and Elhiel, one a hopeless romantic, the other cynical beyond his years. There was the Argonian, Pale Eyes, a loyal and true soul, and the Redguard Zaharia, a born leader of men. And lastly, she found her muscle in the orc warrior Urgnok, and in the Nords Skjold and Bjormund, their bodies as unbreakable as the eyes of their ancestors. Altogether, it had the makings of a full-fledged organization, rivaling that of any major guild. They had members pulling off jobs from Bruma to Dune, raiding warehouses and pillaging farms. With every crate added to their coffers, Tira hoped their influence could spider across the breadth of Tamriel, earning both fear and respect amongst those who plied their trade in the shadows. As bandits, however, they would rely first and foremost on the sacking of caravans. They would stalk the highways and thoroughfares for carriages full of goods and quickly relieve them of their belongings. For this task, the Khajiit, Mesara, found herself best suited. Her eyes were keen at identifying a heavy wagon from the spin of its wheels to the tracks carving through the dirt. She could spot a weary guard by the slump of his shoulders or the pace of his gait. Her eyes saw clearly even in the dead of night, while others were slaves to the light of their torches. And what she lacked in strength, the other bandits were willing to provide. On this night, however, their victims put up little fight, their numbers comprised of monks and priests who were all too ready to unite with their makers. The wagon they plundered was destined for a temple, and its crates full of treasures that offered more tribute than gold. "Do you think Tira would like this?" asked Mashara, popping her head out from behind the wagon, an amulet of Talos dangling from her ear. "A bandit has no need for gods or prayer," grumbled Urgnok, wiping the blood from his battle axe. "It's a terrible gift." "Nonsense," encountered Bjormund unloading a crate. All Nords love Talos almost as much as they love mead. Of course you would say that, Frostlicker, snarled Urgnok, but by Malakath, Tira is not like the rest of you idiots. She has taste. If Tira were like any other Nord, Urgnok would have never pledged her his axe. In his mind, the Nords were pale-faced, poetry-loving giants who ate with their fingers and drank from a horn. Tira, however, did not think or feel or smell like the other Nords did, and more importantly, did not fight like them. She preferred the acrid bite of a Sujamma bottle to a snowback's honeyed drink, and despised poetry in all its forms. He surmised she might have been from Morrowind, but the orc was not the type to pry into another's business. "Oh," said Mashara with a mischievous grin, the amulet swaying as her ears perked up. "And what are you planning to get her, Urgnok?" "What? Why would I get her anything?" the orc replied coldly. "You'll all be dead in a year anyway." Mashara blanched at the words, unsure if the orc was making a joke or speaking prophecy. While hardly a mage, Urgnok was known to dabble in dark magic, wearing tribal scars and marks on his body and totems of bone around his neck. Unlike with the blacksmith, Yaktu, his anger seemed to stem not from the hardened nature of his blood, but something deeper and personal, and it colored every conversation they had. The others stood in silence at his remarks until the young Bosmer, Fathris, broke the ice. "Speaking of which, did you want anything for the holidays, Zaharia?" he mewed, a rose of blush affecting his soft brown skin. The Redguard, in return, paid him little heed as she examined the wagon's horses. "If you want to get me a Saturalia gift," said Zaharia, pointing the arrows lodged in the wagon's side, "work on your aim. I'll feel better about having you at my back when you can kill more than planks of wood." "That is all well and good," interrupted Mashara, "but there is far more important matter than life and death, for this Khajiit still does not have a suitable present." "If it's from the heart," Fathrus said, eyes fixated on the Redguard, "the amulet will be good enough." 2 weeks later, on a cold Saturalia night, Tira Bloodfire awoke to the sound of a crackling fire. A note was placed on her private safe, which she opened to find an amulet wrapped in cloth. The Khajiit had snuck into her room earlier and left the gift and the fire behind as proof of both her generosity and skill. Tira was not religious by nature, but as she stood in that warm, reddish glow, something about the amulet of Talos resonated with her. Perhaps it was the letter she received from Palladius that morning about an encounter with the Thalmor in Dune. In that instance, a thought crept into her mind and soon blossomed into an idea. The following day, she beckoned the blacksmith to her chambers, the idea having matured into a plan. I want you to forge me more of these amulets, Tira said, placing the axe-shaped necklace on the table before her. The blacksmith picked up the artifact and studied its make, thumbing across the intricate patterns grooved into the piece. Unlike other amulets, it was simple yet ornate, its blades casting a neutral tone that neither reflected nor absorbed the surrounding candlelight. "This is made with dragon bone and scales," Yaktu replied. "Hard to come by these days, but a replica should be simple enough. I guess my only question is, why? Seems odd for bandits to turn to the divines for help." Last week, there was a trade caravan traveling on the Silver Road, torched by Thalmor justiciars, Tira said. Apparently, they killed the merchant on suspicion of Talos worship, and it's not just here. I've gotten word from Palladius that the Thalmor are making an effort to eliminate anyone and everyone in possession of these amulets, whether it be men in the streets or wagons on the road. "Wagons," replied Yaktu, "like the ones we sack." "Exactly. The amulets aren't armor or jewelry or tribute," said Tira. "Their motive. We place one on every caravan we sack and torch the wagons when we're done looting them. The guards blame the Thalmor and we keep the spoils." Yaktu nodded and took her leave, mind set on forging the amulets. Tira knew well enough that the smith didn't need the artifact with her, having already committed it to memory. The blacksmith genius was different from others, quiet, removed, and matched only by her insatiable work ethic. The amulets would be done by daybreak, and there was no need for this one to be included. Tira returned the amulet to the safe when she noticed another item nestled amongst the piles of gold and gems. It was the tooth of an orc chief, one typically earned by besting its owner in single combat. Tira herself knew of one such orc, a son who had been forced to kill his father against his will. Heartbroken, the son wore his tooth as a keepsake around his neck, fearing the day he would have to slay his future children. Until one day the son met a Nord bandit who became blood kin of the tribe and challenged him to a duel. The bandit bested the orc in single combat, and recognizing the pain that haunted him, freed him from his duties as chief. She asked not for his tooth, but his blade when the time came. Yet it wasn't until the Nord formed the Crimson Dirks that she returned to that orc and asked him to make good on his oath. Tira smiled as she recalled the memory. She didn't know Urgnok had pulled the tooth, but it didn't surprise her in the least. Book 3. Palladius looked outside the window of the Crescent Moon's Inn, watching the patrons below shuffle through the market stands. A Nord butcher, catching his glance, waved hello to the Imperial before returning to his trade. At the table behind him, Erwan and Edward were with the buyer, playing an old Khajiit game of tiles and bones, a fool's wager given they barely understood the rules. As the Septims slowly poured over to the Khajiit's end of the table, Palladius's thoughts turned to his friends back in Cyrodiil and prayed to Zenithar that luck had found them in their part of the world. "If Khajiit may ask," he said, adding an ante, "this merchandise you wish to move, is it by chance connected to the recent theft in the palace?" "Khajiit may not ask," snapped Irvin, "or Irvin will remove his tongue." "Pardon his rudeness," the cat demurred, "but the sands are full of talk regarding the haste of the clan mother's treasury." "Oh, give him a break," teased Edward. "If you wanted to hide your identity, you probably should have chosen a disguise that didn't include the clan mother's personal wardrobe." Irvin scowled at her brother, angry at herself for not having a proper comeback. The Khajiit, meanwhile, glanced at his tiles and fiddled with his ring, an action that did not go unnoticed. Yes, although it was not the silk, but the sword that gave her away, the Khajiit said, revealing another winning hand. "A common blade would have not such an elegant scabbard." "We should drop the weapons and just grow our nails out," Edward sighed as the cat's claws raked in another pot. "Maybe then we'd have better luck." "If you want to take that risk, be my guest," Palladius chimed in. "But if we get into a fight, I'd feel better if my hands were clutching imperial steel." "You'd feel better, sure," Edward countered. "But how do I know I wasn't destined to be a mage?" There was a time when Palladius wondered the same about Edward. At first glance, he was more dashing noble than thief, but behind the smile and charm was a cunning and calculating wit. Some might argue that Edward was better suited for the job than Palladius could ever be. For the best rogues cut their enemies not with the edge of their dagger, but the sharpness of their mind. Either way, Khajiit is excited to meet such daring thieves. How many outsiders would even try such a thing, given the consequences? "What do you mean by that?" Edward replied, examining his tiles. "Well, the clan mothers are allies of the Dominion. Their eyes are all-seeing, and their punishments are known to all who hear the screams." "And what do you think about that, Furball?" Irvin interrupted, eyes focused on the Khajiit. "Are you a fan of the Dominion? Do you have paintings at home of Lady Aranelia in a fancy lace?" "Khajiit does not care for politics," he said, raising the pot. "He is sorry to have brought it up." "Oh, don't mind my sister. She is just touched by Sheogorath," replied Edward, calling the bet. "I, for one, love a good political discussion. It allows us to find a common ground. After all, why do you think people get into conflicts in the first place?" "Khajiit would assume it is because two sides cannot reconcile their differences." "You'd think that. One person calls Talos a man and the other a god, and the next thing you know, they're at each other's throats. but I've seen blood feuds started over the love of a woman and wars fought over inches on a map. The truth is, people don't fight because they're different. They fight because their motivations are one and the same. That's true whether you're the Empire and the Thalmor, or a clan mother and a thief. And what, by the moons, unites you and the clan mother? What is this motivation you both share? The same thing that drives you. Edward smiled, laying out his tiles on the table. Greed. The hand was indeed a winner, but of greater concern to the Khajiit was the note Edward placed beside it. The merchant recognized it immediately. He had penned the letter that morning with the intent to betray them to the clan mother in exchange for a hefty sum of sugar and gold. Startled, he reached for his weapon, but it was too late. Irvan had already drawn hers. "It doesn't matter," the Khajiit merchant said. "This letter was for the clan mother, but the one to the guard is already..." Before Edward could interject, Irvan slit the Khajiit's throat. As the blood splattered all over her silk garment, a scream could be heard from the market. A Thalmor justiciar, flanked by 2 guards, had dragged the Nord butcher from his stall, accusing him Talos worship. The justiciar tore open the butcher's tunic, but found only an amulet of Mara. The butcher replied with a toothy grin, asking the Thalmor if she was spoken for. The justiciar, disgusted, tossed the butcher into his stall before returning to her patrol. Palladius shut the window. They may have won today, but the war was another story. For now, they had a long journey ahead of them and a body to dispose. Book 4. The tavern fell into silence. Cassivel squinted at the young Bosmer, trying to get a read on his mood. Just hours earlier, the lad had embarked on the biggest quest of his life, the kind of endeavor that turns squires into warriors, boys into men. "Well, what did she say?" he asked the young bandit. "She said she would only wed me," Fathrus said, "if I brought her the scale of a dragon." The tavern burst into laughter, patrons smacking their tankards against the wood. "What?" Fathrus replied, clearly confused. "What's so funny?" "I'm sorry, lad," said Cassivel, "but I think that's her way of saying no." Fathrus was crestfallen. It had taken nearly all of his courage to confess his love to Saharia. What meager defenses remained in his youthful frame, Cassivel could not guess, but they stood a little chance against this latest assault. In fact, with each passing second, Fathrus's shoulders slumped further and further into his chest until he was more guar than a man. Taking pity, Cassivel decided to massage the boy's ego with a tale of his own first rejection when a familiar voice croaked at the pair from across the room. "A dragon scale, you say?" Not a soul had realized Antonius was in the tavern, mostly because the bandit mage was a permanent fixture. From dusk to dawn he teetered upon his wobbly chair, drinking all manner of spirits by his lonesome. Over time, he began to blend into the scenery like an odor that only strangers could smell. By the 9, do you know where I can find one? Fathrus beamed with shoulders out, his once gloomy face resurrected with life. I'm a wizard, am I not? Antonius said, before letting out a dignified belch. A bandit wizard, Cassivell interjected, and with all due respect to you and your profession, I don't think you're helping. Nonsense, Cassivell, scolded the mage, nearly tripping over his own feet as he sat at the table. The boy needs a dragon scale, and I aim to help him find one. But the dragons have been extinct for centuries upon centuries, Cassivell said. You are a really bad student, scoffed Antonius, jabbing his finger into the Dunmer's forehead. This is why Tira favors Edward over you. At least he pays attention. Forgive me, mage. Only the divines can forgive you, my son. Drink this bottle, and it will take you to them. What about the dragon scale? Fathrus whined, growing impatient. Oh right, that. Well, it just so happens there's an old Nordal legend about a warrior named Ulfnir Bone Skin, Antonius explained, flecks of spit flying out of his mouth, who slew the serpent worm Vitrelnak and fashioned a powerful armor from his scales. When he died, instead of giving his armor away to his ungrateful pupils, he did what any self-respecting warrior would do and buried himself with it. Well, that's too bad, said Cassivell, hoping to derail this runaway carriage. Surely it would have been emptied out by grave robbers by now. You would think, Antonius screamed, raising his voice for no reason. But they say Ulfnir's corpse haunts the barrow near Jorgrim's overlook and kills anyone who dares try and take his armor. I see. So it's a challenge, Fathrus exclaimed. In order to wear Ulfnir's armor, one must first best him as a warrior. Either that, or he just doesn't want some random stranger wearing his clothes. How would you feel if I showed up to your home wearing your undergarments? But yes, you kill Ulfnir, you get your dragon scale. You get your dragon scale, and you get your wench. She's not a wench. She's the most amazing woman in all of Mondes, and I'm going to marry her. Sure, whatever. Cassivell breathed a deep sigh as Fathrus's heart grew ill with hope. The only saving grace was that Windhelm was thousands of leagues away, and Fathrus was still a pup. Perhaps when he was ready for the work, a word or two with Tira could send him further away still. Yet, whatever remedy he devised would be temporary. He had seen that look too many times to deny what would come next. A fortnight later, Cassivell returned to the tavern. It was the same as it ever was, for the most part. The wenches tended to the patrons, and the patrons to their stress. The bards sang tales of old and new, and the drunkards, not knowing the lyrics, still saw fit to join them. Antonius was perched in the corner as always, a bottle in each hand and several more on the ground. It was like any other Fredas, save for the empty seat beside him. He would break the news to Tira in the morning. The Bosmer would not return. Book 5. Irvin was convinced the ring was cursed. At first, the proof came in small doses. There were bad streaks at the card table, sudden pain in her tooth, and stale bottles of mead. Soon, the proof took on a larger, more dangerous form. Her blade would miss its mark, potions would cure too slowly, or she'd step on a rune that her barbarian companion, Skjold, had no business skipping over. Then there was the greater proof, the instances that threatened their livelihood. There was the coin drying up, new guard patrols at the usual haunts, and word that the East Empire Company had taken notice of their works. All told, it augured a slow, tumbling march toward the end of the Crimson Dirks. Knowing this, a smart person might have cast it out, tossed the foul ring into the heart of Iliac Bay, and let the waves ferry it to the forgotten shores. A wise person might have taken it a step further, destroying the artifact and its ill-fated magic, so that no person, past or present, would ever come to harm. Irvin, of course, decided to wear it around her neck. With regard to the ring's nature, she told only the barbarian. Her brother Edward would refuse to believe her. The others would demand she get rid of it in whatever manner best fit their inclinations. Skjold, on the other hand, would neither object nor disapprove. Whenever she confided in him, Skjold would simply stare at her blankly and let out a guttural snort before chewing on the nearest piece of meat. Skjold, after all, was not just a barbarian, but one who wore that label like a badge or an honor bestowed upon him by the High King. Of words he knew few, and when he wrote them down, rarely did he put them in the right order. The only thing that spared him from further ignominy was the fact he couldn't speak. As the story goes, the leader of the Crimson Dirks, Tira Bloodfire, found him in a cage with his tongue removed, and upon freeing him gained his axe. To this day, it was never clear if Skjold was a lawyer to her or the crew, or whether that distinction had any meaning to him. If Tira asked him to back Irvin on the job, he would do so without question and absorb whatever secrets, insults and curses the Breton decided to fling in his general direction. That theory would be tested the moment she stepped on that rune. Earlier that week, they had received a tip. A new crew had set up a smuggler's operation in one of the old ruins outside the capital. It was supposed to be a simple task. They were to meet with the clan leaders, flex their muscle, and come home with new members or a percentage of the take. It all would have gone according to script, Irvin thought, had the ring not been cursed. "This is all your fault," she said to no one in particular, while glaring at her disobedient hands. Moments later, the Breton had awoken to the sounds of chanting, a low and ominous moan floating through the chamber. The rune had blurred her sight, but it was the haunting refrain that seemed to dull her focus, unable to cast a spell. Regardless, it was clear their captors were more than smugglers. Irvin didn't need to see the source of the chanting to know it was bad business, no matter how long Skjold mindlessly pointed in that direction. Well, At least it isn't cannibals, Irvin sneered. Although you being a choking hazard might have worked in our favor. Skjold wasn't the brightest Nord, but he knew when he was being insulted. In a past life, he would have simply crushed Irvin's skull and taken a nap. Moreover, cages were nothing new to him, and Irvin's noisy jests were to him signs of panic. But he had sworn a vow to protect the charges of the one they called Bloodfire, and so, rather than kill the Breton for looking at him oddly, Skjold continued to point, much to Irvin's confusion. The shrine behind her was Daedric in origin, large, twisted and barbed, its stems ugly and misshapen. Blood dripped from its ebony thorns, spilling past the cage and down the stone steps like shifting roots. At the base of the steps stood robed cultists, lost in their supplication, flanked by guards dressed in Daedric armor and mail. Despite an open roof, the air in the ruins was thick and noxious, and the shrine seemed to throb in the blood moon's light. As the light shone on the altar, the cultist chants began to turn more vehement and forceful. The voices continued to rise, louder and louder, until one of the guards broke from his stance, climbing the steps toward the cage. Seeing this, Irvin bared her teeth and snarled at him like an animal, but he continued his approach undeterred. As the chants hit a crescendo, Irvin could no longer hear her own thoughts, seeing nothing save the cold, black gauntlet split through the bars and reach for her neck. With a thrust, the guard grabbed her by the head and slammed her into the bars, drawing his weapon with his other hand. With spit bubbling from her mouth and her body pressed against the iron, Irvin screamed at Skjold every manner of insult she could contrive. But the oath continued to sit in place, his finger still extended, even as the cultists' chant drummed against their ears. Only now the finger was pointed to the ground, tracing a circle. Irvin looked down and saw the ring, glowing hotly on her chest. Skjold didn't need to tell her what to do next. She wrung herself free of the guard's grasp, and not knowing what would happen, placed the ring on her finger. The chanting stopped, and in its place, the shrill cry of weapons drawn from their scabbards. The Daedric warrior turned his attention to the cultists, but it was too late. Irvin's spell of hysteria had taken hold, her focus restored by the power of the ring. One by one, the cultists turned on each other, their rage driven by hers, and when the clangs of metal faded and the screams turned to silence, Irvin collapsed, having exhausted all of herself and the ring. As the hours passed into the day, Irvin lay there on the floor of her cage, letting the sun splash through the bars. Skjold snored softly in his corner, shifting on occasion to scratch himself. Outside, ravens picked at the flesh of the dead, sharpening their beaks on the bones and paying no mind to the living. The others would come looking for them eventually and fetch Mashara to pick the lock. But for now, Irvin was content as she was. She held up the ring against the sky, circling the area where the moon once stood. Perhaps she had made a mistake, and the ring wasn't cursed after all. But Irvin still held out hope. Book 6. Edward taught Antonius the game he learned in Elsewhere, as Cassivel, Elhiel, and Zaharia joined them at the table. A cloth stained with every conceivable color of wine and spirit was placed over the top of the wood, allowing the bones and tiles to slide across its otherwise splintered face. While some of the rules were lost in translation, Edward knew enough for the game to function. Moreover, if he were to bend said rules to his favor, his opponents would be none the wiser. There are two types of games, Edward explained, laying the tiles out on the surface. Those with perfect information and those that are imperfect. Chess, for example, is a game with perfect information. We know each other's pieces and their placement on the board. Card games, on the other hand, are of the imperfect variety. We are each dealt a hand with a set value and must divine, through whatever means are available to us, and who has the better of it. "And which type do you prefer?" asked Cassivel. "I prefer to know who and what I'm dealing with," replied Edward, "but at the same time, I know the more practical skill is to play games where the information is imperfect. After all, that is how the world around us is played." "I wasn't aware life was a game," said Elhiel, "because if so, I need to find a better way to cheat." "Don't be so modest," replied Edward, raking in another pot. "I think you're doing just fine. The same can't be said for our friend Antonius here." "I only lost because you distracted me," barked Antonius, "with that inhaling and exhaling thing you do with your nose." "Do you mean breathing?" asked Edward. "Yes, that." As a careful study of others, Cassivel understood the gist of Edward's speech. There were layers beyond what faces advertised. Edward, for instance, used his charm and intellect like a sword, his sly demeanor having a purpose that disarmed his opponents. Elhiel, on the other hand, wore his humor like an armor, deflecting any inkling of emotion or motive. Zaharia, for all her straightforwardness, was also passionate and sincere, making her prone to falling victim to her temper. Even Antonius, for all his inebriation, was a skilled hedge mage, and one wondered at times if his drunkenness was merely a performance that allowed people to excuse his worst impulses. The same rules applied to the crew as a whole. The less that was known about the bandits, the more imperfect the information, the better their chance of survival. Their enemies would always hold the better cards. The only way to win was to bluff. It's for this reason Cassivel was uneasy about the last job. They had purchased a building near a warehouse, tunneling into it and stealing the goods. The plan was solid and the profit healthy, but it was the target that worried him still, even now after it was complete. After all, unlike some enterprises, the East Empire Company was a machine that counted every coin to its last and weighed every commodity to the gram. Their employees were punctual, their accountants circumspect, and their ledgers pristine. They would identify precisely what goods were stolen and investigate thoroughly the time and manner of the theft. Thus, It weighed heavy on his mind when the forger who purchased the building next to the warehouse had not responded to his last letter. Cassivell wrote the missive posing as a concerned relative, not wishing to betray any secrets lest the forger had been compromised. Another concern was news that the company had enlisted the help of the local guard captains in an effort to pool their information. With the added protection, caravans had been harder to sack, and with a more watchful eye on merchants, goods had been much harder to smuggle. As it turned out, it was possible to rob from the East Empire Company, but not without revealing some of their cards. "Did you know that pale eyes can sing?" Elhiel said, much to everyone's surprise. "Is that a joke?" asked Zaharia, somewhat surprised. "I'm being serious. He's actually better than most bards," Elhiel replied, for once completely sincere. "Trust me, it shocked me more than anything. I wasn't even aware Argonians could even make that kind of noise, let alone do it on key." Cassivell laughed at the thought of the shy Argonian melodically strumming his lute. Even after he thought he'd learned everything there was to know about the others, they were always surprising him in strange and interesting ways. Perhaps the same could be said about their current predicament. So long as they were free, it meant whatever information their pursuers had was still imperfect. The bandits had revealed much of their cards already, but hopefully they had yet to give away their entire hand. Book 7. The assassin's trail stretched further into the woods. Azrael took the lead, with the Argonian and the Bosmer in close pursuit, following the thread of tangled brush and loose mud. As he knelt to study the tracks, a hint of Jess Bay bloomed on his tongue, a side effect of the night eye that the mages could not explain. The tracks seemed to pause around a great oak tree, as if their owner had stopped to rethink his method of escape. Thumbing the crook of his chin, Azrael listened for the footsteps of his fellow bandits, not wanting to turn his head. The assassin was close. Hours prior, the night began with a toast. A courier had brought news of merchandise coming in from jobs in the Highlands and the Gold Coast. It was the first sign of charity Stendar had showed them in months, ever since the Guard and the East Empire Company had taken a special interest in squashing their operations. With all their leads dried up, the Crimson Dirks were left to sacking caravans and petty thievery, the kind of work they were willing to do, but always resented. However, with this latest news, their coffers would be as full as their cups. In addition to obtaining a cache of valuables from a Daedric cult, they had raided warehouses holding enchanted swords from Anvil, Colovian furs from Coral, along with crates of silks and fine robes weighted with perfume. In order to launder the goods, the bandits, led by the Dunmer scribe Cassivell, made contact with a merchant noble, knowing he had connections across Cyrodiil. That night, they solidified the pact over a flask of wine and a gourmet feast. It was a landmark occasion for this group of rogues and misfits to be legitimized in their dealings by a class above their own. At that moment, the end of the Crimson Dirks might have seemed like the furthest thing from reality. Now, with Cassivell wounded and the merchant dead, it seemed almost inevitable. "The trail ends here," Asriel said, motioning to the trunk of the looming oak. "Maybe the tree ate him," quipped the Bosmer, his Argonian partner, pale eyes trailing behind him. "You jest, Elhiel," replied Pale Eyes, "but in this one's village there is a story of a hist corrupted by magic that would kidnap and devour the hatchlings." "Okay, I have to ask," the Bosmer replied. "Why are there so many stories about monsters that eat children? Are parents so inept they have to constantly frighten their young into behaving, or are children really that delicious?" "I feel like as a Bosmer," countered the Argonian, "you would know better than I." "Quiet, you two," warned Asriel. "He's here." Asriel knew this was no time for banter. He could feel the taste of Jaspe dim in his mouth. The night eye would not last much longer, and when the spell snapped, their eyes would be ill-adjusted to the sudden darkness. The assassin knew this as well. He had counted the seconds left in the spell and baited them to this point, where the long trees shrouded the moonlight. He had wagered on the fleeting light in the eyes of his pursuers, knowing his had yet to expire. He knew that blinded by the night, the Altmer would raise his hand and use the last of his magicka to recast the spell. And in that moment, he struck. The assassin's dagger aimed for Asriel's neck, slicing at the seam between his armor. He knew the elf's left arm would be occupied by the spellcasting, unable to guard his naked artery. And when he fell, the others would turn to his falling corpse, giving him ample distraction to kill them both. All of this seemed as academic as the death of the merchant, the one whom just hours ago they had failed to protect. And yet, inches away from its mark, his dagger was stopped cold. The assassin tried to wrestle it free, only to find it clenched in the Altmer's fist. It was a feint. The elf had raised his hand, but never cast a spell. Dropping the dagger, the assassin leapt back, having given away his position for no more than a bloody hand. Asriel and the others rushed to subdue him, but he was far too quick. With his remaining dagger, he slit his own throat, taking the secrets of his masters to the grave. "So, who wants to explain this to the boss?" Elhiel quipped, trying to lighten the mood. "Because I've got a list of about 30 people I like to blame in situations like this." "There are no words that can justify the death of our failure," Asriel grumbled, wrapping his wound. "We lost the merchant and his killer. Cassivel is wounded. But perhaps, despite all this, we can learn something from the corpse." "An assassin this skilled," remarked Pale Eyes, "must work for the East Empire Company." "Worse," said Asriel, examining the cuts of his armor. "It seems our merchant friend was dealing with more than just bandits, but the Thalmor as well. Because this man we killed isn't with the company. He is a spectre." Elhiel's face grew dim with the implication. It was one thing to make an enemy of the guards in the city, the East Empire Company, the clan mothers, and even the great houses of Morrowind, but this was altogether different. It was not the size or strength of their foe, but their knowledge they feared, and the Penitus Oculatus were spies of the highest order. If the Empire had been tracking the merchants' dealings, it was only a matter of time before their identities would be discovered and shared with all who opposed them. The only question was, how much time was left? Book 8. In his time with the Crimson Dirks, Urgnok had killed countless men and heard all manner of reaction to their deaths. He'd heard women gasp, men cry, and children scream. Yet never in his life had he heard the noise that cascaded from the archways when he plunged his sword into the belly of his assailant. Applause. When the crew disbanded, many of the Dirks were forced into the shadows, yet Urgnok's path took a different route. He met with a face butcher, adopted an alias, and joined the arena. And for the most part, the tactic seemed to work. These days, the only pursuers the orc feared were the adoring fans that followed him in the street. I suggest you turn around now, Urgnok grumbled, seeing a shadow cut through the door. The last fan who annoyed me was this baker. He offered me a pastry, and I smashed his face in. Now he eats his sweet rolls through a straw. Funny, the shadow replied. I seem to recall a sparring session years ago that ended with you crying back to Tira like a newborn babe. Zaharia, what are you doing here? I came to see our mutual orc friend, the Red Guard said, examining a nearby weapon. I see you have already paid her a visit, judging by that armor. Dwarven, right? Although not exactly what I pictured. Urgnok spit at the ground, acknowledging what she left unspoken. The blacksmith was a magician with a hammer and anvil, working with all types of metal. Perhaps that was how the Red Guard puzzled out his identity, yet it was unlikely a blood kin would betray his confidence. You know, the funny thing about fighting styles, Zaharia said, swinging the practice blade, is that they're almost like fingerprints. You may have changed your armor, your name, and even your face, but I recognize that clumsy top foot of yours almost immediately. Doesn't matter, Urgnok sneered. The guard haven't sniffed me out yet, and they won't ever. I've been able to hide in plain sight, while everyone else is dying in the shadows. Hiding in plain sight may work in the short term, Zaharia said, sliding the weapon back onto the rack. But over time, you know what happens to things in plain sight. They get seen. Cut the crap, Zaharia, the orc groused. We both know I don't care what you think. True, the Red Guard replied, handing him a letter. But you'll care about this. Urgnok wasn't sure how he was discovered, or who wrote the letter to the guard. Had Zaharia not killed its bearer, he would already be in chains. He stopped short of accusing Zaharia of forging the note, however. She was crafty, but not a liar. Where? North, said the Red Guard. Get into one of the strongholds, or take a job fighting in the pits. Either way, you can't stay here. Book 9. Tira had forgotten which heist was her favorite. Perhaps it was the time they stole a wagon's worth of silks from the desert palaces of Dune. Maybe it was when they burrowed a tunnel into the warehouse of the East Empire Company, siphoning crate after crate while the warden stood mindlessly at the door. Or it could be she preferred the more violent raids, like the sacking of the Argonian supply caravans, or the attacks on cargo ships leaving the Imperial City waterfront. Or perhaps, if she looked back far enough, her fondest memories would find her in the streets of Balmora, robbing travelers at knife point. For some reason, it was this version of her, this long-forgotten stranger, that seemed the most vivid now. Gone was the refined, thoughtful countenance of a leader, and in its place, a hungry, ash-hewn child who had more courage than sense. And if she closed her eyes, she could still feel the smooth, polished surface of the ruby the noble dropped in her palm, and how it felt like nothing of this world. Yet, it was not the price or the feel, but the color of the ruby that she remembered most. The blades of crimson burned into the glass, like the fire of the Red Mountain. "Why do you think it is," she asked Azrael, "that our thoughts turn to the past when our lives are so close to death?" "I suppose because it's pointless for a dead man to look forward," replied the bandit, his Altmer frame filling the breadth of her doorway. "But I take it you didn't summon me to talk about old times." "Elhill says the city guard knows about the hideout. They plan to raid the place in 3 days." "So they will," Azrael replied, his face unflinching. "What of the spoils?" "We can't take it with us," Tira lamented, "but I'll be damned if I let them have it. We give what we can to the beggars and toss the rest into the bay before we leave." "As you wish," said the High Elf. "And where will you go?" "Our best chance is north," Tira said, tracing her dagger up the map. "The Jarls are fractured. It's only a matter of time before the whole province is at war, but we'll have to move in small groups and find our own way once we cross the border. No contact." Tira knew Azrael would take to the news better than the rest. While Bjormund, Skjold, and Palladius were the muscle, they always made an effort to bond with the group. The High Elf, on the other hand, never felt at ease with the other bandits. If this were any other business, perhaps she would have tried to reach him, but tenderness was not a virtue for killers and thieves. Azrael nodded and took his leave, leaving Tira alone in the quiet. If this exchange taught her anything, she still needed a moment before telling the others. She had always been an expert at masking her emotions, but the sadness bore plainly on her face. Perhaps this situation called for that girl from Balmora, and not the weary woman who sat in her stead. Steeling herself, Tira placed the dirk and the ruby in her pouch and stepped away from the map. They would head for the border tomorrow, leaving behind much of their past, but the future still unwritten.